I'd like to share with you this afternoon regarding climate change and its relevance to Nepal, because I find this a bit timely. At the moment, COP26 just supposed to be concluded this Friday. Still, I have to see the outcome. I have seen the draft outcomes which were under negotiation, so still need to follow up. Hopefully, we'll come to some of the good negotiation in COP26, and I think it's timely that we discuss this issue. So my intention this afternoon is to basically talk about three things. The first is that I'm going to give you maybe a bit of a pessimistic picture regarding where we are heading in terms of global greenhouse gas emission, despite all the hue and cry about climate change since 1990. I want to show you a few quick trends and what does these trends really mean for climate negotiation, which has much also impact on what is ongoing COP26 in Glasgow. Then also, I also want to very briefly put there into, okay, if we meet the Paris Agreement, which is being negotiated, also some of the nitty-gritty at Glasgow, what does it mean to us? Does it help us to meet aspiration of the Paris Agreement? Where do we stand globally? So I just want to talk that, and also in that context, I think Nareshji has already mentioned that Nepal also has made quite an ambitious commitment by being net carbon neutral, net zero emission by 2045. So we can also do a little bit discussion on that, and I think in whole context, where do Nepal stands? What are our interests, and what are the few my own thinking from outside what Nepal could do? So I'll try to put some of those points. Hopefully, it will help us. Just 2 months back, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) released its first assessment. It's a first working group's assessment report in August. I'm not going into the detail of it. There is a scientific consensus that climate change has already taken place, and if we don't do anything in the future, we'll be in very, very bad shape. So I think I'm not going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty of the science which has come out from this sixth assessment report, so Working Group 1's report. But what it tells us is that global warming has already happened by about 1.1 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial era. Right, so later on we'll discuss that. Our goal in the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees Celsius climate stabilization, but we have already hit 1.1 degrees Celsius already, and that rate is faster in recent decades. And also, this IPCC report says that climate change is already affecting all of us. We have already seen very widespread, rapid, intensifying, and unprecedented climate change, which we haven't seen in last thousands of years. So which is very important, particularly important for Nepal, because even if we say 1.1 degree global warming happened, there is a disproportionate effect in the country like Nepal, especially in the high altitude region and especially the mountain regions. So sometimes even we say 1.5 degrees Celsius, but actually there will be a disproportionate implication in the regions like ours where the mountain communities sit. That's only 1.5 degrees is only global average, but actually in the country like Nepal, in mountainous area, it is going to be much bigger. And also it says that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the aspiration of Paris Agreement, will be beyond our reach, which basically calls for rapid action. It tells that cost of action is much less than cost of inaction. And if we don't start acting now, it is going to be very, very difficult in the future. So that kind of scientific agreement we have presented. I myself work very closely with the IPCC in Working Group 3, which is a mitigation. Our report, we actually finalized our report last week. We submitted IPCC report. Our report will come out hopefully April next year. That's a Working Group 3 mitigation. But we have very limited emission space from now to the future. That means if we want to stabilize global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, then the amount of the greenhouse gas we can emit from now is very, very limited. We have hardly 420 billion ton of CO2 equivalent is left to emit for us if we want to really stay under 1.5 degree with a 50% likelihood. But of course, if we say that, okay, we want to stabilize only at 2 degrees Celsius, not 1.5 degree, we have some space. We can still emit around 1270 billion ton of CO2 equivalent. What I'm trying to say is that our time is very limited. We have a very limited carbon emission budget that we can spend from now to next a decade or two if we want to stabilize global warming and we want to stay within 1.5 degree, which is the aspiration of Paris Agreement. But if you really look back to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it tells us that the objective of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentration at the level which should avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. What is dangerous? Is 1.5 degrees dangerous? Is 2 degrees Celsius dangerous? Is 3 degrees Celsius dangerous? We have agreed in the Paris that we would aim for below 2 degrees Celsius and towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that there is a kind of consensus, there is a kind of goal that would help us to stabilize climate greenhouse gas concentration at the level, then that would really avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, there are a couple of important points which is important from the negotiation perspective. For example, the issue of the intergenerational equity, which means that we should not pass on our burden to the next generation and we should start acting now. So this intergenerational equity is a very much fundamental pillar of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And second important pillar is common but differentiated responsibility. That means that developing countries are at very early stage of development, but developed countries are already developed. So our issues are common, but our responsibilities are differentiated. That means that developed countries need to do more, but developing countries also need to do their fair share. But the developed countries should support developing country for so-called 3 different means of implementation: technology transfer, climate financing, and capacity building. So these are somehow enshrined in UN FCCC principles in order to cater the needs for developing a country. Now, despite, as I said, all the hue and cry about climate change since 1990, you will see in this figure that our greenhouse gas emission has relentlessly increased. The decade of 2000 saw the very highest growth rate of 2.3% per year greenhouse gas emission. But in this decade, in 2010 to 2020, that acceleration has a little bit deaccelerated, but still our global emission is very high. Roughly 58 billion ton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emission we emit in annual basis, which is quite big number. And also it's very important to note that in 1990, developed countries were emitting lots of emissions and developing countries were emitting very less. But now coming to 2020, now you see that developing countries are emitting far, far higher greenhouse gas emissions than developed countries. So this whole notion of responsibility debate also has shifted in UN FCCC debate, because no longer developing country can say that we are developing country, you developed countries, you guys cause a climate change, we don't want to do anything. That era has gone, because the developing countries are the one who are emitting more than 60-65% of the global CO2 emission. So even if the developed countries make their emission zero, still it's not enough to control climate change, which basically means that we, from the developing country, we also need to act, but based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, we need to ask developed countries for means for support: international climate financing, technology transfer, and capacity building. So that is kind of negotiation as we see ongoing. So yes, COVID has dampened the growth of CO2 emission, in particular little there. You can see in this graph roughly 6% CO2 emission was reduced in year 2020. But sadly, we are already projecting that emission is going to bounce back. The latest report we published from Global Carbon Project, released a week back, 10 days back, we have projected that 2021 greenhouse gas emission will more or less catch up what we had in 2019. That means all the gains in emission, which happened due to the COVID, will be bouncing back next year. That means we need to put more effort. And internationally, coal is the major source for greenhouse gas emission. That's why the coal-dependent economies are in hotspot. Countries like India, China, they are in very hotspot from developing country because they rely a lot on coal. So coal constitutes a major share of the global CO2 emission. Out of 35 billion ton of CO2 emission, coal alone caused 14.7. This is the projection for 2021. So coal is a major source, but as you can see, the natural gas is slowly replacing coal, which help us for better energy transition, but still renewable energy need to kick in if we want to be more serious. Now, one important part of this discussion is that what are the countries which emit more? You can see in this figure that China surpassed United States as the largest emitter in the decade of 2000. China started shooting its emission, as you can see in this figure, from the year 2000. Again, the major culprit is a coal used in China. Now China emits almost 11 billion ton of CO2 out of 35 global number. So China is a big emitter. So 5 major emitters globally are China, United States, European Union, EU 27, India, and then Russia. So these are really 5. Then after that, South Korea and Japan. So these are the largest emitter. But in Europe's case, emission is declining already. In case of United States, also CO2 emission has declining thanks to the shift from coal to the gas in United States. But in the country like India, China, and other developing countries, the emission is rising. But of course, in negotiation, equity is a very important dimension, right? So we can say that okay, China is emitting more emission. India has huge emission, but there is 1.3 billion people in China. There is close to 1.3 billion people in India. But if we look at the per capita CO2 emission basis, you see that United States is way higher. 14.2 ton of CO2 per person is the United States emits. But if you look at India, for example, only 1.8, right? So similarly, the global average is around 4.5. But again, here something to note in case of China is that even in that case, China has already surpassed European Union in terms of even per capita CO2 emission. So China is a big player, but China also has shown very positive posture in COP26 and also climate negotiations in the recent year. Now again, other contentious point in negotiation is how do we allocate responsibility? Not from total emission, but also per capita emission, and also from the viewpoint of consumption versus production. For example, sometimes people in developing countries argue that developed countries is shifting their industries to developing countries, and more emission is being emitted in a country like China because they have become the factory of the world. So if Europe or United States consume less goods and services, they make their lifestyle more sustainable, then emission won't happen. So in this discussion, we sometimes look at emission from either from the production side or at the consumption side. So and the difference between production and consumption is a net CO2 emission embodied in international trade, right? So what we see in this figure here is that in case of the country like United States and European Union, their production attributed CO2 emission is higher than the consumption attributed CO2 emission. But in case of countries like China and India, production attribution of CO2 is higher than consumption. That means China and India is actually for themselves, emission needed is less, but they emit more because they also cater goods and services for European Union and United States. So in this negotiation, this kind of responsibility debates are quite interesting. But despite I showing you a bit of a pessimistic trend of rising emission, then there are also some good, I call it silver lining in the dark. You know that many countries have submitted nationally determined contributions, NDCs, in a run-up to the Paris Agreement, and also before the Glasgow summit, they have revised their commitments. We call it enhanced NDCs. Now that enhancement is being done by different countries, and we are in the process of enhancing the emission commitments, continuously, which is good news. Also, there are at least 3 dozen countries where emission has declined consistently for over a decade now. Of course, emission is increasing in many parts of the world, but in few parts of the world, emission is declining also. So we should learn from them how to decouple GDP growth from CO2 emission, or how to reduce absolute amount of the CO2 emission. So we have a lot of good practices slowly emerging. We have a lot of prospects from technology. You might have noticed even in Nepal that the price of the solar PV is really coming down dramatically in last several decades. The price of solar particularly, and also other things like wind and also other renewable energy technology has really declined. So that is a good news, because renewable energy help us to displace the fossil fuel such as coal, gas, or the oil. So technology is improving, renewable energy is being cheaper, so that is also going good news for us globally. But as you know that things like wind and solar, they are an intermittent source of energy, because there is no sunlight, there is no electricity. There is no wind, there is no electricity. Now, that means that we need to store the energy if we want to rely on intermittent source such as solar or the wind. But good news is that the battery storage cost also declining rapidly in last several years. And also some of the projections tells us that the trend is going to be decreasing in the future. More than 50% declining in the battery storage is going to happen by 2030 compared to 2016. So we see some of the good results there. And also other good, and good result is that electric vehicles has really caught up the world quite dramatically. We have already more than 10 million electric vehicles on the street by 2020. And in several countries, there's a very ambitious electric vehicle plans. And we like or don't like, I think we all like that electric vehicles is going to be a vehicle of the future. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind. It's not a question of if, but it's only a question of when. Electric vehicle is coming, absolutely coming. And I think we should be more prepared for that. And also other good news is that the share of the renewable energy in the global energy mix is increasing. At the moment, 26% of the global electricity generation comes from solar. In terms of the megawatt capacity, it's already 33%. And you'll be surprised to hear that in recent years, in the annual capacity addition, electric power capacity addition, 82% annual is renewable. Only 28%, not even 28, sorry, 82, 100 minus 82 is actually 18%. Only 18% of the new capacity addition in 2020 is actually non-renewable. 82% of the capacity addition in 2020 globally is already renewable. So you see this kind of trend where we are heading. These are all good directions for us to move in climate change. Now, in this context, as I said, COP26 is happening. We have gone quite a long distance from UNFCCC adoption in Rio Convention in 1992 to now. We had UN Framework Convention enter into the force in 1994. We had a so-called Kyoto Protocol adopted in city of Kyoto in 1997, which gave rise to a lot of flexible mechanisms such as CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. Even in Nepal, we have several CDM projects are running, and Nepal is earning money from the CDM credits. Now, Kyoto Protocol was good, but it's not enough. Kyoto Protocol was good for kick-starting carbon market and lots of other things, but it's not enough, because 5.2% decline is meaningless if we really want to talk about climate change. So now then we wanted to move to the higher ground. We started negotiating that in Copenhagen COP15. We are not very successful, because coming up with a global target seems very daunting task because of the differences between developed countries, developing country, and especially the rapidly developing countries also. Now, in that context, in Copenhagen could not come up with really what target we wanted. But after the Copenhagen and from the Copenhagen, the new climate discussions emerged, which are called the place-based bottom-up approach. That means we can't impose top-down target globally, then why don't the countries themselves start pledging, okay, I want to do this much. Then let's see where do we head. So after the COP15, that kind of bottom-up place-based system really started, and after that we reached to the Paris Agreement in 2015, where every country made their pledges in the name of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and that pledge will have some kind of oversight mechanism coming from the top, so that the country once pledged, they must fulfill their obligation, and then encouraging country to ramp up their level of ambition in next stocktake cycle of 5 years. So that is what we instituted in Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement was very good in the sense that this is the very first time, irrespective of developed countries and developing country, everybody agreed that we are going to reduce emission. But this is a place-based bottom-up system with top-down oversight, and every 5 years is a stocktake cycle, and in every 5 years we ramp up the level of our ambition. In the meantime, we try to make a so-called Paris rule book, which means that we need lots of rules in place in order to make this system happen. And also good news about the Paris Agreement is that we agreed below 2 degrees Celsius climate stabilization and towards 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was quite an achievement, which gave very clear signal to the broader stakeholders that world is very serious about climate change. Especially policymakers gave a very strong signal to the business investors, business community, private sector, and whole society that we need to decarbonize our energy system. We have to upscale renewable energy. We can't rely on fossil fuel, and we have to shift our investment. We have to make more smarter cities. We have to develop our technology much more faster, and we have to improve our land use forest. So all these right signals were created from the Paris Agreement. And also good news there also is that $100 billion was committed by developed countries for developing country by 2020. Unfortunately, that place hasn't been held into the place. When I look at the recent data, that number still hangs around 70 to 80, depends on who reports, but roughly 70 to 80 billion dollar has been there around, but not $100 billion yet. But also the challenge of the Paris Agreement is how to set up the rules, and also the challenge of implementation of the commitments and moving to the higher level of ambition. Because whatever we have committed in the run-up to the Paris Agreement or to the Glasgow Summit in this week, that is not enough to meet the aspirations of Paris Agreement. That means if you want to really stabilize climate change into 1.5 degrees Celsius, whatever countries have pledged right now, that is not enough. Recently, UNFCCC released one interesting report which tried to see, okay, if we assume that all the countries which have submitted enhanced pledges, if this country meet those pledges, is it enough for us to go to 1.5 degree climate stabilization path? The answer is no. That will still leave us to 2.7 degrees Celsius. That means even if all these NDCs are fully done, still we are in the path of 2.7 degrees Celsius. Still not enough. But we can do more. Maybe you heard that lots of countries have done so-called zero emission commitment recently, including Nepal also did in the run-up to the Glasgow. If we combine together all these legally binding net zero emission commitments, that will still keep us to 2.4 degrees Celsius climate change. If we assume that all the G20 countries actually follow 1.5 degree climate emission pathways, even in that case, it will put us into 2.1 degrees Celsius, right? But we can do it. And if these countries put some effort, we can do it. Then, of course, many international organizations have come up with many interesting studies how to reach 1.5 degree climate stabilization pathway, and also especially how to ramp up the level of emission for midterm, that is for 2030. Otherwise, it's very easy for people to commit for 2050, but what about 2030? This is something very interesting question. Now, International Energy Agency and many other agencies, many other scientific community have done some studies. They have created a pathways on how to reach 1.5 degree climate stabilization, what we need to do. So basically, many research tells us that we can achieve 1.5 degree climate stabilization, but we need to upscale our best practice technology. We have to change the investment. We have to have very strong policies. We need to have a cooperation between developed and developing country, and all of us need to work together. If we do that, 1.5 degree climate pathway is possible. So lots of those studies are quite positive, quite encouraging, but the question is that we all need to work together. So in that context, let me also say, in that context, where does Nepal stand? Because we are here in Nepal, and also you heard that Prime Minister has made a commitment in Glasgow that Nepal wants to be zero carbon emission by 2045, and also Nepal is quite a vulnerable country, as many of us know. So if you really look at what's going on in COP26 in Glasgow, they are finalizing so-called the Paris Rule Book, which basically means that in Paris Agreement, whatever was agreed, we need to have now rules in order to do that nitty-gritty of that. For example, it talks about the carbon market. How do we enable carbon markets? It talks about emission accounting. How do we set the rules for the very transparent reporting of the emission and also actions and support? Can we have some common time work for emission reduction commitments? How to do sustainable energy transition, especially end coal immediately and other fossil fuels sooner? How to do that? So that is kind of being negotiated. How to enable and enhance the adaptation actions, especially for developing countries. And one very important aspect, is very important for Nepal, is also issue of loss and damage. How to avert, minimize, or address loss and damage, and can you create an international financial mechanism or support measures in order to support for loss and damage in the developing country? So that is being negotiated, and that is a very important aspect for Nepal also, because we are very, very vulnerable. And especially a lot of deliberations going on in Glasgow regarding global climate finance after 2025. I mentioned to you that we agreed for 100 billion US dollar, after Copenhagen and after Paris Agreement. But after 2025, there is a lot of discussion to really raise the level of the global climate financing. And of course, the other things are how to respond to the latest science as more knowledge we have, and how we need to raise our level of emissions. Those are being discussed in the Paris. Now, in that context, if you look at Nepal's emission, I don't know how much is Nepal's emission because our data is pretty old. The reason I said is that our third national communication, we submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our data we submitted for 2021 report is from 2011. It's a 10-year-old data. So 10-year-old data, we emit around 54 million ton of CO2 equivalent. 54 million CO2 equivalent emission. But of course, we are net sink. That means we take more CO2 from the atmosphere than we release. So in terms of net, it becomes 28 million. So our net greenhouse gas emission is 28 million, but our actual emission is 54 million, because rest is taken up. Our forest takes CO2 from the atmosphere. So if we account for that, the sink from the land use, we are in better situation. But our emission is quite rising. If you look at our emission compared to 2001 to 2011, it has doubled. And we can't rely always on only land use change or forest to uptake more CO2, but we have to also put effort to reduce emission directly. Now, other related, reasonably good news for us, which needs more scrutiny is all this climate change debate has likely very much synergy is for lots of other sustainable development goals for Nepal, because we talk about renewable energy. We talk about many other things which really help us for lots of other sustainable development goals. And many studies have shown that climate action do have lots of synergy with other sustainable development. So how we put our priority in the overall development planning so that we harmonize all these things together. So there is, I think we have opportunity and we need to work. Now, Nepal submitted its first nationally determined contributions, which was not very good. But our second NDCs, which is we submitted recently, now we have improved quite nicely. Our second nationally determined contributions we submitted in December 2020. Although we don't have an overarching target, but we have lots of sectoral targets and a lot of activity targets. For example, we have a targets for clean energy. We have targets for electric vehicles. We have targets, we talk about electric cooking to displace the LPG. We talk about waste and wastewater related targets. We talk about halting deforestation and reaching 45% of the total area of the forest cover by 2030. At the moment, roughly around, I think, 37% forest cover we have. And there is a lot of reliance on electric vehicles. Our target says that 25% of the all private passenger vehicle sale, including two-wheelers, in 2025, 25% by 25, which is good, and also 90% by 2030. Similarly, for the public transport, for the public passenger four-wheel vehicle sale, 20% by 2025 and 60% by 2030. There is also ambition for 200-kilometer electric rail by 2030. So at least we have started putting some of the numbers there so that some clear policy avenues can be done. And also, as we mentioned many times, that Prime Minister made a commitment to become net zero emission by 2045 in the Glasgow. We have done lots of policy and planning work in Nepal. You can see in the screen there is a plethora of policy planning documents. Only in 2019-20 you can see the list of documents we created. Only in 2021 you can see the series of reports we have created. That's nice, which is necessary, but not sufficient. I think what is important is implementation. What is important is moving forward. Now, regarding net zero emission, still I have to see the detail. What is the government's plan to achieve net zero emission target, which has been announced in the Glasgow by 2045. If you want to compare with other countries, for example, United States said that they want to be net zero by 2050. China and Russia said that they want to be net zero by 2060. And India has said that India wants to become net zero emission by 2070. But Nepal said that will become net zero emission by 2045, which is ambitious, but it needs to be backed by policy planning and implementation. Now, what could be the different way to reach that? I showed you that our emission has really increased, but our forest cover is increasing. Maybe we are taking more CO2 uptake from the atmosphere. So scaling of electric vehicles is good for us because it displaces oil, and particularly electric cooking also help us the LPG. Carbon offset, if we can sell electricity to India, and in the future if we could develop a carbon offset of hydropower export, that could help us, but that is too long thinking. Also the better electricity provision to energy intensive industries such as cement and others, where they are relying on diesel and generating set or other things, that will help us, and more carbon sequestration by forests and land, that will help us. So definitely these are the points which are going to be the basic elements, but still I hope that government would come up with a convincing and solid plan on how to achieve net zero emission by 2045. I hope there is some enough homework has been done. But what we need is that how can we do this, how much it is going to cost us, where do this investment and financing comes from, and whether we have a solid plan. I hope that we'll be able to see that in the near future. So in that context, in Nepal, we have very fragile Himalayan ecosystem and economy. And we are very much vulnerable to the impact of climate change, whether it is climate hazard, whether it is change in our hydrodynamics, especially the rainfall pattern change and some other ecosystem related with that. Nepal's vulnerability is more from water-induced related vulnerabilities, generally speaking. And also we have to start thinking about lots of climate proofing of the key upcoming infrastructure. I'm sure Dr. Lohani would definitely talk about this need for climate proofing in our infrastructure, especially even simple things like hydropower plant. For example, they need to think about how the climate change is going to affect our hydropower, then what kind of infrastructure, so-called climate proofing, need to be done in anticipating what is going to happen in next 20, 30 years from the climate change. So I think we have lot to do in terms of infrastructure. And also we have to tune our climate change agenda to help our other sustainable development goals. How to do that? And there are a lot of good elements for us. For example, clean energy transition, forest preservation, infrastructure development, urban development, waste management, public transport. Somehow good news is that we have a synergy in all these things with the climate change mitigation also. So I think challenge for us is also how to utilize some of the international mechanism in the name of climate change. Then we supplement our own development and we meet our sustainable development goals. I think there we need a bit more homework, and I see a lot of positivity and a lot of synergy there. And also we need a very strong knowledge support. I mentioned to you that we don't have a clear mechanism to even do annual greenhouse gas accounting, how much Nepal emits. Even in our third national communication, our best data is from 2011. If you ask me today how much is Nepal's greenhouse gas emission, none of us know. So I think we need some of the knowledge support system we need to develop in terms of greenhouse gas inventory, risk assessment, impact assessment, adaptation option analysis, and their feasibility. I think here my own feeling is that we are lacking a lot of knowledge support. We are lacking center of excellence in universities, in the think tanks, in different institutions. So I think this is one area important I want to highlight. And second important thing is for us is carbon financing. If you look at Nepal's enhanced nationally determined contributions, NDCs, it tells us that we need $25 billion for our NDC implementation. That is $25 billion is put forward in the report. Where did that money come from? I'll show you that internationally there is a lot of money floating around in international climate financing mechanism. So we need to ramp up our ability to tap international climate financing. I'm sure Dr. Lohani would talk about this as Dr. Lohani headed billions of dollars of the climate financing when he was in ADB. And I think we have plenty of money there. But what we need a policy consistency, bit of evidence-based planning and implementation. So for us, I see for our deliberation and discussion, I want to put the 3 points there. Hopefully, we can discuss. The first is that we need to develop research centers, center of excellence on climate change, whether in the universities, whether in the think tanks, from the mitigation side, from the greenhouse gas accounting, from the adaptation side, in the agriculture, in the water resource, infrastructure, mitigation of climate change, energy and all. So at the moment, we really don't have very strong center of excellence in Nepal. So I think how to develop such research centers and center of excellence, I see that as one of the major issues. For example, we want to access climate financing for adaptation. We want to access the money which might come for loss and damage. We need an assessment. Without evidence, without clear evidence and analysis, even accessing money is very, very difficult. So even for our own benefit, I think even for evidence-based planning, we need research centers, we need center of excellence. And I see that we need to really ramp up our effort in creating research centers and a center of excellence. And second is that upscaling capacity to access international climate financing. I'll show you some of the numbers. The international architecture of the climate financing is quite complex. There are so many different channels from which we can get money in the name of climate financing. But one of my students did one recently study. We tried to analyze what are the barriers to access international climate financing in Nepal, and I'll show you some of at least one of my slide that coordination and awareness, these are quite seriously lacking. And the third point I want to make is that in order to address issue like climate change, we need economy-wide policy instruments. Bits and pieces here and there doesn't help us to get too far. We need economy-wide policy instruments. Now, countries are not experimenting. Many countries are doing the so-called the carbon pricing, such as emission trading, cap and trade based emission trading system, or the carbon tax. Carbon tax helps for energy transition, move from fossil fuel to renewable energy, because fossil fuel emits more CO2, so tax is imposed based on CO2 emission. So I also want to, in Asia, now many countries have started implementing carbon pricing. Singapore was the first country which started carbon pricing of 5 Singapore dollar per ton of CO2 from 2019, January 1st. Now the Indonesia is starting a carbon tax. Now even in country like India, for example, they don't call it carbon, emission trading, carbon pricing, but there is a mechanism called perform achieve trade, PAT system. For example, if you reach certain energy efficiency standards of technology, then actually you can get some kind of credit out of it. So this pricing mechanism is happening in many different ways, and in Nepal also already benefiting from CDM, carbon offsets. We have potential to get money from REDD plus, reducing emission from avoiding deforestation. Those mechanisms we have there. I think this carbon pricing is something for us to think. Now, how much money is flowing internationally? The recent data shows that global climate finance stands around 632 billion US dollar in 2000, and this is the average of 2019 2020. 632 billion US dollar is a global climate finance flow. Of course, out of that, almost everything flows to mitigation and adaptation. Out of 632, only I think $46 billion is only from adaptation, but the majority of money really go to climate change mitigation, and most of the money, comes both from public sector and private sector. So public sector provides around 51% of that global climate financing, but the private sector 49%. So it's still quite a strong share from private sector. Now, for example, if we want to really meet 2030 climate financing needs in order to move along with the 1.5 degree climate stabilization, we need to really ramp up our finance flow somewhere from 632 to 4.35 trillion US dollar by 2030. That means climate financing is really moving up. And for Nepal, our one NDC, in order to fulfill or meet our one NDC, we need 28.4 billion US dollar. So now, at the moment, internationally, around 70 to 80 billion US dollar is being directed from developed countries to the developing country at the moment. Now, that includes both private sector, private sources, and public sources. If you look at only international public financing, that stands around 50 to 55 billion US dollar, purely from public international finance data. So what I'm trying to say is that the global architecture of climate finance is quite complicated. This looks like a spaghetti chart here. There are many different ways through which the money comes. There are major donors. They channel money through their one ODA agency, or through their dedicated carbon funds, through the United Nations system, or through multilateral banks, or from other mechanisms. So money flows in many different ways, right? For example, Germany had International Climate Initiative, IKI, which directly gives money to things like GIZ, KFW, BMZ, many other agencies, which also gives money to the multilateral institutions. So money flows in many different ways. So I think we have to understand how money flows internationally, and how to tap this money, and where are the big pools of money lies. As I said, there is a dedicated climate funds developed by the countries themselves, such as International Climate Initiative of Germany, or through their bilateral agencies, or through they channel money through multilateral agencies. Again, multilateral, some money flow through development banks. Multilateral banks like ADB, World Bank, European Investment Bank, or Inter-American Development Bank, or African Development Bank. But other money comes from UNFCCC system under the purview of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate, such as the Green Climate Fund. Green Climate Fund is governed by UNFCCC, UN mechanism, but Dr. Lohani knows more. Things like CTF, Clean Technology Fund, or CIF is not governed by UN system. That money comes through multilateral development banks collectively. So there are lots of channels through which money comes. The question is that how do we become smart, try to use this money flowing around and enhance our capacity to access that fund, which ultimately help us to meet our development goals, benefiting from this climate financing. I think this is where we need to put much effort. If you really look at, there is a lot of tracking framework, how much money is flowing. One website really tracks international public financing money, around 41 billion US dollar. You can see which are big donors there. Green Climate Fund, Fund IRM and the GCF1, collectively around $20 billion. You have a CTF, Clean Technology Fund. I think Dr. Lohani was instrumental in CTF from ADB when he was there. They did a pool of 5.4 billion US dollar. Similarly, there are many different programs where the money is there. Now, if you look at Nepal, Nepal is accessing 298 million US dollar. You can see Nepal there, 298. So, least developed countries, also some are very successful. For example, Bangladesh is accessing already 636 million US dollar. So I think how to really make use of this international financing mechanism. Now, my own research I did with one of my students tells us that Nepal has a lot of barriers to access international climate financing. We carried out survey-based approach. Actually, it was done as a master thesis by one of my students. Actually, she now works with the British Embassy. Actually, we found that the first major barrier for us to access international climate financing is a limited coordination. Second is the inadequate academic research to guide the government officials. The third is limited understanding of the potential public-private partnership initiatives. And there is silo culture, frequent transfer of government officials, challenge to translate policy into action. So we have lots of such barriers in order to access climate financing. So how do we ramp up our capacity in order to benefit from these? I think this is very important. Now, I'll not take too much time, but I only want to say that from the carbon pricing side, there are many different ways through which we can introduce carbon pricing. At least internationally, there are at least 5 different ways to price the carbon. First is through the emission trading system. So, for example, what the European Union is doing, what California is doing, where city of Tokyo is doing, where the China is doing, and there are many cases what we are doing globally, emission trading system. And second one is the imposing carbon tax. There is a lot of experience on carbon tax. Third is the offset mechanism. For example, CDM projects, CDM money Nepal is getting, that is one example of the offset mechanism. But also there are so-called voluntary carbon markets internationally. So this voluntary carbon market also is quite a big market for an offset mechanism that Nepal can benefit. And there are a lot of other things like result-based carbon financing, especially in the case of deforestation avoidance. And also emergingly, there is so-called internal carbon pricing. The private sector is imposing carbon tax internally. For example, Microsoft, or let's say Google, right? So let's say Microsoft. I mean, what Microsoft does is that Microsoft impose internal carbon tax to its different business units. They create a common fund based on their emission. They have to pay carbon tax to the internal carbon fund, and that fund is used to support them to mitigate carbon and also to buy a carbon offset to become Microsoft as a carbon neutral. So the corporate sector is also really getting into the internal carbon pricing. So maybe our corporate sector maybe at too early stage, but at least these things are slowly moving international. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe we should also start thinking about carbon pricing, and at least we are already benefiting from CDM, REDD, and some other mechanism, and that will really help us. So internationally, there is a lot of carbon pricing has already happened. This is a map in these countries, different kind of carbon pricing already introduced. Lately, Singapore and Indonesia, a couple of countries in Asia also, and they have such plans. And I also mentioned to you about the voluntary carbon market. At the moment, we already have around 6 billion voluntary carbon market already globally. So we can also utilize such kind of mechanism. But again, we have to ramp up our ability to really handle this. So I'll end my talk just again, highlighting three things. What we said is that the developing research centers and center of excellence on climate change is very, very important for us. Without knowledge, without evidence-based planning and policy, we can't move too forward. Upscaling our ability to access climate financing is very important, and we have to, since we are also very ambitious, we want to be zero carbon emission by 2045. Piecemeal basis is no longer solution. If really we are serious about that, we have to think about economy-wide policy instruments. We have to see which one is the right policy instrument. Bits and pieces doing sectoral is necessary but not sufficient unless we have economy-wide policy instruments.